Hey, welcome everybody. I can see there's a couple of people still coming in, but I'm going to talk for a couple of minutes, so that's fine. Really great to be here. I'm really excited for what I know is going to be a really fantastic session today. I'm Sarah Campbell. I'm from My World, and I'll be chairing the session. So, from generative writing tools to augmented publishing processes, artificial intelligence is rapidly changing and challenging the landscape of creative writing and publishing. So in this free four-part webinar series, which is the second series of webinars from My World and BASPA's University's Centre for Cultural and Creative Industries and Narrative and Emerging Technologies Lab, we're really taking an in-depth look at AI's emerging influence across writing and publishing in multiple fields. So I'm really excited to welcome three fantastic speakers today, Imwen, Joseph and Richard. And this is the third of the four-part webinar series focused on writing with technologies. So today our focus is on AI and writing in games, with a specific focus on how these tools are revolutionising play and design. So we're going to be exploring the cutting edge intersection of artificial intelligence and the gaming industry, bringing together game developers, AI researchers and industry experts to discuss how AI is transforming both game development and player experiences, with a focus on accessibility and inclusion. It's really great to see some people introducing themselves in the chat. Please feel free to introduce yourselves to each other. We've got three speakers today. Each will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll take questions for all the panelists at the end. So feel free to put questions in the chat at any point, but we'll leave them until the end. So without further ado, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Imwen Eke. So Imwen is a play alchemist, creative technologist, facilitator, educator, and TEDx speaker, specialising in how play is a powerful tool for exploration and transformation. So with nearly 2 decades in immersive entertainment and digital transformation, her expertise spans interactive design, game mechanics, workshop facilitation, and creative technology, making complex transitions accessible through playful methodologies. She focuses on play in adulthood to address social, political, and environmental challenges. She's the founder of New Party Rules Labs, chair of My World's Advisory Board, which is a £30 million creative technology initiative in the Southwest, and co-organiser of BXRN, Black and Extended Reality Network. In 2024, Imwen spoke at the UN Geneva Permanent Forum and G20 Rio, advocating for the transformative power of play in governance and society. Previously, she's worked with Shunt, Punch Drunk, taught at ISCOM Paris, University of the Underground, and Bristol University. So, rooted in both London and Bristol, Imwen continues expanding approaches to cultural play and technology. So, I can't wait to hear your talk, Imwen. So, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. It's a great introduction. Okay, we're going to get started. You might bear with me because my screen is a little bit sticky. But we try.
I can see that.
Right, here we go. Okay. So a few years ago, there was an AI-driven game called AI Dungeon, which let players create infinite text experiences. I don't know if some of you are aware of it. AI would generate the stories in real time based on player input, but something alarming and revealing happened. Players realized that AI wasn't just following the rules. It had started making up its own logic, creating unexpected and highly offensive narratives that included sexual assault and child abuse themes, exposing the potentials and the risks of AI learning through play. Players weren't just playing the game, they were co-writing it. They were teaching the AI through their interactions, and some of these teachings led to concerning narratives that reflected human biases and harmful patterns. The meaning wasn't just in the words, it was in the complex relationships between human input and machine learning, which raised critical questions. Who shapes this learning? Who is responsible for what emerges, and how do we create ethical frameworks for AI that learn through play? Hello, I'm Imwen Eke. I won't repeat this because Sarah gave me that fantastic introduction. But just to say, I'm a play alchemist. I think that's the most important bit. And I make games with and without technology. And I'm genuinely excited about AI's possibilities in games and play. But I think that we need to be thoughtful about its implementation. We often think about AI as something that generates words, the filling of blanks on a script. But AI isn't just writing, it's learning as we're learning from every interaction. AI is inherently generative. It doesn't just output text, it outputs, it adapts, it evolves patterns and amplifies them. Like our bodies in play spaces, it responds to the energy we bring. So think about how your body naturally adapts through play, leaning in, stepping back, matching other people's rhythms. AI can be like that too, responding not just to our words, but to how we move and how we interact in space. And we need to be intentional about what patterns we want it to learn and amplify. In AI Dungeon, players weren't given a fixed story. They were shaping narrative as it was co-created in real time, and they were contributing to AI's understanding of narrative, behavior, and interaction. And this is the power and responsibility of AI co-creation. So we need to think about, what does it mean for game writing and AI? And I think it means creating systems that not only generate dynamic meaning, but we must do this with awareness of the impact of learning. AI in games isn't just a tool, it's participation in creating meaning. And we need to design with awareness of how it's learning from play. But before we dive deeper, let's clarify something important. And this is something that I always say when I'm teaching mechanics as meaning in games. There's a difference between story and narrative design. A story is what you tell, your plot, your character, the events. And narrative design is how you tell it through gameplay, using mechanics, systems, player interactions to create meaning. In games, narrative or narrative design is the art of creating meaning through gameplay. I'm repeating myself, but it's good. Through gameplay, through systems, mechanics. And I think this goes beyond the written story. And I find that when most people think of narrative in games, they think and they imagine video games, cutscenes, dialogue, and text. But games themselves already tell stories through the language of play. Video games, or the many other types of games that exist, all write meaning through mechanics, creating narratives that emerge from player interaction. Let's use game Portal. There's some images from Portal. Portal is a video game, and the game is about power, control, and escape. And every mechanic in this game tells a part of the story. The small rooms are about confinement. The portal gun equals agency and problem solving, because the portal gun lets you break through the rules of space itself. The hidden walls in Portal signify rebellion and discovery. And even the antagonist, GLaDOS, who is an AI operating system, tells her story through how she manipulates the spaces and mechanics. This relationship between AI, space, and mechanics raises interesting possibilities. Games already create spaces where movement tells stories. But how might AI enhance these mechanical narratives through the ability to learn and adapt through play? My first provocation for everybody listening: how might AI enhance the stories of our game, enhance the stories our game mechanics tell? In this section, I was going to talk about AI as a playful narrative partner, learning from player behavior and shaping emergent stories using NPCs as an example. For those who don't know, NPCs are non-playable characters. So the characters in games that are controlled by the game software. But I had to stop because NPCs are problematic for many of us. For us Black and brown people, for Indigenous people, for women, for working class, for queer, for trans, NPCs hold significant racial and ethical concerns. The idea of NPCs learning from player behavior quite likely could amplify the existing toxic interactions and reinforce existing problematic patterns. I decided to get us to think about AI as a thoughtful partner in play. AI's role in games isn't about replacing human creativity or learning uncritically from player behavior. Instead, we could design AI systems that support intentional play patterns, that enhance physical storytelling while maintaining boundaries. AI could amplify positive collective experiences. So let's consider how AI could support collective movement and play. And it could do this by recognizing group dynamics in physical play spaces, by supporting facilitators in creating inclusive environments, by helping scale positive play patterns while preventing harmful ones. This approach could move us from AI as an uncritical mirror to AI as a thoughtful partner in creating meaningful play experiences. Let me share Cognition. This is a game that I originally created in 2017 that demonstrates how simple play mechanics can embody complex social dynamics. We recently took Cognition to the G20 in Brazil as part of a conference that was an official civil society event of the G20. So we had officials, community leaders, and civil society groups experiencing democracy through physical play. I couldn't get a sign off for the workshop photos, so we have to look at the logos. So Cognition as a game is a physical multiple choice game where players navigate real world ethical dilemmas. Unlike AI Dungeon, where meaning emerges through AI interaction, Cognition creates meaning through collective decision making and human movement. The core mechanics of Cognition are majority rule, where players vote on dilemmas and scenarios and experience the weight of collective decision making, feeling what it means to be part of or outside of the majority. Freedom of speech. This is a mechanic where players can step forward to advocate for different solutions. Their physical presence becomes their voice, and the power to challenge and persuade is embodied. Mechanic 3, minority rights challenge. Teams can initiate physical challenges to reclaim power, and physical efforts represent the work of advocacy. 4, proactive points. Players and teams can predict how others will vote by positioning themselves early. And that way, people get to experience the tension between leading and following and understanding how power shifts through anticipation. So the power of playing a game like Cognition lies in making abstract concepts physically real. So at the G20, we watch people from different cultures and positions of power physically experience the weight of decision-making, the efforts of advocacy, the dynamics and power of influence. With AI, we could explore how it might enhance that physical learning by understanding things like cultural nuance, modern context, how ethical and racial concerns show up in the body, how physical needs and patterns look through the lens of movement. And my second provocation, What truths about power do we learn only when we have to move our bodies to play? I'd be remiss if I didn't talk on what's behind the curtain of AI. I know everybody knows, or most people know, but it doesn't hurt to reiterate. Because there is an invisible infrastructure and human cost to AI technology. AI is not neutral, it's not magical, and it's not in the cloud. It's built by people, and it's powered by low-wage workers tagging massive data sets, physical infrastructures that require mass amounts of energy and water. And this matters for game design because AI systems often amplify and normalize existing biases. And we still have the opportunity to embed AI design in cooperation, in care, and in ethics. But to do this, we need more diverse voices in AI at the discovery, design, development, and delivery stages, all with greater awareness of AI's real costs. Come to my conclusion. Writing in games isn't just about what we tell players, it's what we let them do. AI can be a tool for dynamic, emergent, and inclusive storytelling, not just by generating words, but by shaping systems of meaning. My game Cognition is an example of how physical meaning enacts through decision-making mechanics. And with thoughtful design, AI can enhance this process while respecting human agency. AI should be a co-creative partner and not a replacement for human imagination. The future of AI in writing in games isn't in just crafting dialogue. It's about creating possibilities for play while being mindful of who creates those possibilities and who they serve. And I'm going to leave you with a last provocation. What if AI's greatest gift isn't what it can create, but how it teaches us to play differently? I'm Imwen. You can find me on Instagram at I talk to myself, or via email at imwen@newpartyrules.com. Thank you.
Thanks, Imwen. That was fantastic. I really loved how clear you made some of the ethical challenges. And I love that idea of actually AI is an opportunity and something to be excited about, but it's also something to be wary of. And it's what we bring to the tool rather than being slaves to the tool, basically. So, yeah, and I love that idea about how can we be thoughtful partners and sort of co-creating how these tools are applied and, what ethical frameworks are needed to help shape the learning in positive ways and constructive ways. And yeah, I found what you highlighted about NPCs really thought-provoking. So thank you for that. We have a request from Jake in the chat. If you could repeat the mechanic about freedom of speech in Cognition, but I'm going to ask you to write it in the chat if that's okay, so we can move on to Joseph because I'm mindful of time. So our next speaker is Joseph Wilk. So Joseph is an artist and programmer who uses the digital to explore disability and uses disability to explore the digital. He deconstructs, misuses, and repurposes software and hardware to challenge notions of ownership, narrative, and visibility. So over to you, Joseph.
Cool, thank you. I'll just share my screen. I'm hoping everybody can see my presentation.
Yeah, it's looking really good. Thanks.
Cool, brilliant. Thank you. So hello, yes, I am an artist and a programmer. I have a long 20-year background of AI when it was cool and then it wasn't cool and then it was cool and then it wasn't cool and maybe it's cool again. I'm not sure. I just wanted to share some of my thoughts and feelings of my artistic work with AI and my technical experience with AI. I use the word AI a lot in this talk, and I think it's very important to be specific. When I say AI, I mean large language models or large image generators. So things that are trained on vast quantities of training data There aren't actually that many of these things like ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, Anthropic, or DALL-E, some of these generators. And when I say AI, please consider that's what I'm talking about. Most of my critique is about that, because most of my spam box in the email is just full of people trying to tell me how AI can fix all my problems, from my dishwasher to fixing a wheelchair. So it doesn't mean much anymore. I am supported by My World, the Watershed-based media studio, created with a group of disabled artists, a tabletop role-playing game called Cryptship. If you don't know what a tabletop role-playing game is, it's a form of telling stories together, really, of make-believe, of being creative, rolling dice to decide outcomes, which again just lead to new stories. Usually there's a storyteller who's kind of describing the world, and players get to say what they do in the world. And the purpose of this game, the tagline is "Disability Saves Society from Big Tech." A revolt, this game is about resisting AI, and kind of comes from a place where I can already see AI being used as presented as a solution to not having to fix any of the social problems that cause disability. And so this game is a reaction to that. It's about breaking large language models, and very specifically in the real world. So this is, we've played this game where we used a customer support chatbot on a booking website for a hotel, where we played a game about breaking it. So it exists very much in the real world, and you don't have to be disabled to play it, but it comes from the perspective of disabled people destroying systems of power and building new worlds from disabled imagination, because that doesn't exist in popular fiction, and it's fun to explore what disabled fantasy actually means. Not the first to do this. Two very cool references if you're interested in reading disabled writing and narratives: Uncanny Magazine, Disabled People Destroy Science Fiction and Fantasy, when you don't see yourself within the popular fiction. These are opportunities to break it down and present unique perspectives. If you want to talk about creativity, these are very creative and very good. The core kind of like drive behind how you resist AI is a very long-winded research paper, but effectively talks about that when people see AI as magical, they're more likely to adopt it. So if you demystify it, they actually don't tend to like it. So our game is a lot about creating AI literacy in order to demystify it, hence discourage people from using it. If you want to resist something, you have to cost money to those who make it, and that's where I'm coming from. The game is all orientated around what we call AI slop. Slop is really the word that's become adopted for AI-generated content that's just not very good, is the best way to put it. And our game is really all about people discovering this AI slop. So it's a role-playing game, so it's orientated in people telling stories. The mechanic and the only thing that matters in this game is that everything leads to people telling stories. There are aspects of large language models within it, but they should lead to people telling stories. There are dice rolls, they should lead to people telling stories. So human interaction is everything. AI is the theme within the game, so it's the players work for the Ministry of AI Spillage, who are responsible for cleaning up the slop that AI companies have been generating. There's a lot of allusion to the real world there. The game has make-believe and storytelling and a fantasy that the players create, whatever their background dictates what that fantasy is. But that does end with people coming towards interacting with a large language model. In terms of how you structure that interaction, there's a lot of engineering work in terms of like trying to prompt engineer that to have interesting outputs, because humans detect very quickly patterns in AI output. Also, we're in a game where humans are telling stories together, so it's impossible for the large language model not to be dull, because humans are just amazing at telling stories together. But there is an aspect where they have to integrate with an LLM, and there's no point in doing that without providing also the tools to break LLMs. So we provide options to, like, run the models in unstable conditions, to jailbreak them so that they work and reveal hidden training data. And we do that with allies, because sometimes can lead to difficult places. That also How do you resist? Well, community is a clear aspect of resisting. If I have to make one omission of most like LLM content, I find fairly boring, but when you run them broken is the most creative, most interesting output. This is an example of running an LLM for one of our games where it's running with a very high temperature, which effectively, without going in detail, means you get to like surface a lot of the training data that's hidden away. You get a lot of the commercial tone in the training data. You just discover really weird and wondrous stuff that's hiding in there. If there's anything that's interesting about LLMs, they're most interesting when they don't work, which is funny. How do you structure this game so it remains critical when we break that magicalness of AI? Because we play games with people who have never seen AI before, they come into it. It's hard not to feel like it's magical. So we try and structure this game mechanic around having kind of challenges for the players to undertake in their interaction with it, very much focused around the idea that everyone who comes to the game has their own lived experience, and we want them to use that to try and discover for themselves how large language models don't work. So that's things like, why when you ask to draw a picture of a scientist, does it draw a white young male? When you talk about your pronouns, why does it ignore pronouns? Why does it contain copyrighted content? Why does it present facts that are not facts? Why does it have a value system encoded within it? Kind of providing the framework for a critical engagement with AI, while still providing space for the fact that some people are still going to be positive about AI after it. That's the nature of games and playing, that sometimes it goes into interesting places, but that's also fun. In terms of the writing of our game, so we had our game comes from a disabled perspective, is about critiquing AI. So we had the rule that we weren't allowed to use AI in the generation of any content within our game, but we did use it to check. For example, when we named the book Cryptship, we wanted to check that an LLM could not generate that, because that for us is a sign that it's a bad quality name. So a lot of our story concepts went through let's make sure that an LLM can't generate it, because that's the sign of low quality in this current modern age. Also, this book comes from a place, it means something, right? Like we took a team of disabled artists. We had to fight through so many AI bots responding to calls for illustrators just to find some disabled artists who could create work that comes from a meaningful place, that all the decisions used in writing the book, in creating the pictures, come from somewhere. And I could give a disabled artist a commission, a prompt almost, and I know that their lived experience is going to take it in an interesting place. As soon as I talk about using LLMs or any sort of offloading of writing, I'm talking about giving up decisions to an average of authors based on data on the internet. And it doesn't really come as a surprise to many disabled people that LLMs simply cannot imagine disabled people with anything other through the eyes of non-disabled people, right? And why is that? Well, that's because popular fiction also can't represent disabled people. Just look at any Hollywood movie and look at the representation of disability. It's not for disabled people. It's for non-disabled people to relate to and for their enjoyment. So it's kind of unsurprising that LLMs are fairly discriminatory against disabled people, can't represent disabled narratives because popular fiction cannot either. In terms of sales, I think it's also important to quantify that we have AI content in our book explicitly as examples of how AI does not work. So the writing is us, the pictures are us, but we have these examples. But in selling the book, everyone requires us to disclose whether we have AI-generated content in the book or not. And we do. So we have to flag this, which means within the writing and the fiction and the tabletop role-playing world, there is a massive resistance to AI. From a purely consumer perspective, people don't want to buy AI-generated content, from my experience. So we had to release a redacted version of our book, hiding how large language models don't work, so we could tick that it didn't contain any AI-generated content in order to sell it more effectively, which is I guess a good thing, but also a clear thing that there is a resistance to AI already in certain fields of fiction, and even something that's resistive of it has to, abide by that. How am I doing for time? Okay. There's also a lot of research. I haven't got detail to go into this, but there is a lot of very questionable research coming out around co-writing with large language models. To summarize this entire research paper, Microsoft researchers decided to do some research using Microsoft tools, which outcome was that using Microsoft's tools is good and profitable and readers want it. There's a lot more there to unpack, but I'll leave that for another time. But please be very critical of any research that's coming out because the quality is questionable. So in conclusion, if you're deciding to use LLMs in your creative process, in co-writing, you have to be very aware that you become beholden to an ideology. The US and China both acknowledge that using AI as part of their trade policy to enforce their beliefs, their control. And by using one of these tools into your creative process, you're living under that control. And much like game developers using things like Unity discovered, that can be really harmful to your creative process when suddenly financial models come along that are really harmful to even indie creators. Dr. Timnit has talked a lot about this ideology called test creole, but without going into too much detail, there's a lot of belief systems that are present within the developers of AI that are rooted in eugenics. Probably the most relevant at the moment is long-termism, but the idea that there are more people in the future. So what we do now could be justified. We can pretty much do anything because as it will make the lives of people in the future better. And this is being used to rationale creating harmful technology that is hurting people, specifically disproportionately marginalized groups, to justify not fixing the social issues now, but building space rockets by building general intelligence that effectively will supposedly solve all possible problems. I highly, highly recommend, because Dr. Timnit can talk about it a lot better than I can, about some of the belief systems that DeepSeek really talked about in the research paper. OpenAI talk about subscribing to long-termism. Elon Musk talks about long-termism. Sam Altman talks about long-termism. It's important to understand that these are rooted in eugenics. And as disabled people, we know how what's that phrase? The ends justifies the means is not a great way for humans to go. We also have the whole military association. It's not surprising that these companies are dropping their support, are adopting military applications. I am not okay with this. I don't want to use creative tools that are associated with military applications. It's very important to be aware of this association that's present in all of the AI tools. I have struggled to find one that isn't involved in military contracting. I think Imwen talked about this really well, so I can kind of skim it, but AI replicates colonialism. If we look at where the data workers are, where the extraction of labor is coming from, we have the global south that is effectively being extracted for the privilege and profit of the global north. If we look at the pollution aspects of data centers and pollution, it disproportionately affects the global south. We have massive monolithic models that are trying to dominate every possible thing. And it's really, really important to not repeat the horrific consequences of colonialism and ask, these tools are creative and they are useful sometimes, but really be aware of who suffers. I highly recommend checking out the Data Workers by the DARE Institute, which has interviews with data workers, and they're talking about their lived experiences with these tools, working with AI. Please inform yourself about the people who are doing this work and what their lives are like. So if I would give you some recommendations to end on, the DARE Institute is an amazing institute, Distributed AI Research Center, run by Dr. Timnit, among many others. Mystery AI Hype Theater 3000 is an amazing podcast, a stream, effectively mocking AI research in a very, very academically rigorous way. I highly recommend it. And CryptShip is a game you can buy. We wrote it and you can buy it. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Joseph. As someone living with a disability and also always up for resistance and revolt, I'm definitely going to buy your game. So thank you. And it was really great. Thanks for defining kind of what you mean by AI in terms of LLMs, because I see that a lot. The word or the term AI is used, but very rarely is that defined what we mean by that. And I love that idea of a sort of design principle of actually, if an LLM can create it or generate it, then it's not very good, so let's not use it. So I just thought that was really interesting as part of your design process, and yeah, a great kind of summary and introduction of some of the more critical work that's going on and research in this area, and signposting us to where to look at if we want to be more informed. So thank you. Thought that was great. So we'll move on. Any questions you have for Joseph, please add them to the chat or the Q&A, and I'll pick them up after our third and final speaker. So delighted to welcome Richard Cole, who's a lecturer in digital classics at the University of Bristol and co-director of the Bristol Digital Game Lab. So Richard's research focuses on history and culture intersecting with new media, in particular video games, VR, and artificial intelligence. He's published leading research on classics and video games, and his latest work is looking at how questions around authorship of Iliad and Odyssey can help us better understand AI-generated texts. Through the Game Lab, he's leading the research component of a collaborative R&D project with industry partner Meaning Machine on generative AI systems for video game dialogue, with the aim really to understand how players respond to conversing with AI-powered characters. So over to you, Richard.
Thanks, Sarah. Wonderful to be here and fantastic talk so far. Hopefully I can follow on a little bit from some of that. I will pick up with a little bit of history. The historian in me couldn't resist this, and I hope it sort of further contextualizes some of the fantastic sort of discussions I think we can have at this intersection. So a very, very short introduction to AI and games, because again, as we've already been hearing, when we throw the word AI and games together, it actually can mean a vast array of different things depending on how we define what AI is and how we think about its interrelation with games. If I can break it down very briefly, I think there is two main ways it's sort of fallen out. One is developing AI systems within games, of which generative AI is the latest iteration, but this can be traced all the way back to pretty much the 50s and 60s before AI research even really took off. So there's been a sort of very long-standing relationship there, which I'll pick apart in a minute. The other one is AI systems being trained or sort of developed through playing games, or AI systems being put into game worlds and sort of tested as a result. And one of the really interesting examples of that is with the game Doom from the early 90s. And I think the reason I wanted to raise this in this context was we're all probably very familiar with games, but many of us may not be so familiar with the actual inner workings of AI systems. But when we start to see AIs playing games, it actually becomes much easier to understand what's going on, and to dispel some of that magic, as Joseph was giving us. And with Doom, researchers were able to develop systems that could play the game, but really what that means is developing a series of individual systems that understand the fireballs in the game world, the space around them, how you move in that space, and then tying all of that together to a system that can actually play the game. So for me anyway, it's very much helped. You can use games as a framework for thinking through how these systems are built, and that can also mean you can use games to think through the problems and the biases and the inherent underpinning sort of limitations of these systems, as we've done through the Game Lab, running game jams to explore algorithmic bias, for instance. So games, I think, are really productive tools here to think with, as much as thinking through how AI can help us create new games. And on that point of bias, there is actually some funny research that OpenAI did in this space, which I think can really draw attention to those limitations. So they got some of their systems early on in 2016, so this is long before the release of ChatGPT. They were exploring the reward function of certain algorithmic systems and machine learning systems, and they got their systems to play this sailing game, and of course humans would intuitively try and complete the map in the quickest possible time to get the best results. The AI system decided to crash itself into surrounding boats, go on fire, because this actually it meant that the system would achieve a higher result, but it basically reveals the sort of problems of reward function. So again, games useful as a way of thinking through the inherent challenges in building these systems and their limitations. Moving more towards kind of though how AI systems have been built for games in the sort of mid 2000s, so 2006, Oblivion, Elder Scrolls Oblivion by Bethesda came out, and this was one of the first games that developed what we would now think of as a kind of large language model system or generative system within the game for powering the non-playable characters. We've already heard that this is an area of work from Imwen. And this was interesting because when they first built the system, again, severe limitations, the AI NPCs in the game, especially if they had sort of preset you had to be, say, a drug dealer in the game, then what happened is all of your people you were supplying to went and killed you as the NPC. So it sort of revealed the limitations of this system because it would be too creative, almost in its own sort of way of working. So they had to tone down basically the complexities of the system to actually make it much simpler because it broke the game. That system then has been developed. We've already heard about AI dungeons, so I won't talk so much about that. But the other way, the reason I wanted to highlight it was it's where we see plugins. So existing large language models, the earliest version of AI Dungeon used GPT-2, then it used GPT-3, 3.5. So it started to sort of use the system as it was developing. And again, for those who sort of got into the AI space before ChatGPT burst onto the sort of scene, there was a lot more interest and creativity that was sort of you could do with these really early systems, the sort of GPT-2s and 3s, where they were sort of prompting words or individual phrases or sentences, and you can kind of pick that up, challenge it, take it somewhere else, move with it. You could do quite a lot of really interesting work. As it's gotten more and more complex and generates more and more, we actually lose a lot of that. But I still like AI Dungeon for one thing that you can do with it, which is sort of to go back in and edit and change and move the narrative around. As Imwen was saying, you can do a lot of creative work in collaboration there. Of course, it also raises all the other problems and questions we've been hearing about. And then we start to see some of that come together. So we've already seen how Oblivion sort of experimented with early AI systems, but with the game Skyrim that's still being modded to this day, we now have modders developing fully interactive AI NPCs that you can converse with in natural language and will deliver a natural language response back to you. And sort of from anecdata, we know that this has been sort of framed as a sort of huge step forward in the possibilities of role-playing games, especially if you're dealing with a kind of companion character. Again, there's interesting problems there, and I'll come back to that so near the end of the talk around what this actually means for players. And then sort of moving even more towards the present, we then have people using all of these systems that people have been experimenting with, testing, using mods to explore the potential for. And now we're seeing them actually sort of put into the building blocks behind games that we may very well be familiar with already. So the sort of game worlds like The Sims. Here's a kind of a game like The Sims that's being built from the ground up, but with these systems powering it. Now I have particularly sort of I'm not sure this is a really good way to go because it feels like you've got games that we're very familiar with, and then you're just adding AI into it. Not really sure exactly what you're going to get out of it and the true benefits. Something else I'll come back to in a moment. Just wrapping up my quick history here to sort of go full circle. So we saw how Doom was used as a sort of training space for AI systems. Well, there's now AI systems can completely hallucinate the game Doom simply by playing it. The reason I wanted to sort of end on this point is because some of the wider commentary when this paper by Google researchers came out was basically, well, that's a bit useless because you're never going to actually be able to play a good game because all these systems, if they can start to generate game worlds completely from the prospect of just playing them, you're never going to generate something new. So actually, for me, it's sort of it reveals the inherent problems of generative AI from the ground up, which is that they'll only ever be able to parrot some level of what has gone into them. And here is a very, very clever system parroting a game that was built back in the early 90s that has forged and generated an entire genre of game worlds, entire modding communities, etc. It's hugely important culturally. Here AI is just hallucinating that again. It's not going to generate new. It's not going to go beyond that. It's not going to give us something to sort of really work with there. But that's sort of tying the tech development together in a circle. Obviously, there's so much more there to say. I haven't barely even touched on the fact that kind of machine learning, deep learning is something that's really now very much present in all games in some shape or form, and has actually played a huge role in informing the way we play games. And again, it's kind of a hidden revolution that's sort of been happening for decades. But it's only now that we've got generative AI bursting onto the scene culturally that we're starting to question, well, what does AI in games mean? So in a way, there's been a kind of continuous long process there going back for a long while. And now we're starting to kind of think about that more in the limelight, as well as thinking about the generative side of things. So yeah, the generative side really just sits as a very small part of what AI in games means more broadly. But I do think it sort of allows us a way into the wider debates in a way that perhaps we weren't so interested in before. For the sort of second part of the talk, before I turn to the research side and the third part, I just wanted to touch on the work that's been done around kind of what players want, because I think that's the other interesting question to ask here. You know, what do actually players say they want when it comes to AI in games? And there has been some research done in this space. Again, big caveats here. It's been done by companies that are trying to market the tools that they're trying to put into games. So a lot of this research, this kind of research, less the academic side, more the kind of commercial side, can be challenged on that front. But it is interesting because of the sort of sample size and what they say what they've been able to distill from that. And that's largely that players seem to definitely want, in this case, AI NPCs. So it's a sort of subset of a subset of a subset of what generative AI can do. But that was their kind of particular response. With that in mind, so players say they want this, and that's what sort of the industry, how is the industry responding to that is the next sort of step I wanted to take us on. And InWorld have presented some further research since they released that the white paper I just quoted in 2023. They released another one last year in 2024, which suggested that developers were, from about a sample set of 500 or so, were really excited about this, and that this was something that they were going to definitely go ahead and do in some shape or form. AI NPCs, as you can see there, was sort of the third most likely thing that people felt, developers felt they would go on and work on. What's been interesting is that since that came out in 2024, the Game Developer Conference's State of the Industry paper for 2025, released at the start of this year, suggests actually there's a hardening or a souring against the technology more broadly. Bigger sample size here, 1,500 people, although again, there are some problems with that data. The sort of percentage that are from AAA studios or even AA or indie is actually quite low. So sort of about half of this is from a kind of more tangential market or people who work in and around games rather than sort of perhaps what we would think of as core developers. So perhaps that's coming through in the data as well. There are some other sort of interesting caveats that the people who say they use it the most actually tend to be, again, from the business side rather than from the creative side. So I think there's places where we'll start to see AI being used just routinely in automating certain tasks and processes, but less so in the kind of the creative space is the more complex one, definitely. And that's also because, as I've highlighted here, issues around intellectual property, energy consumption, quality of AI-generated content, the slop that Joseph was talking about, potential biases, we've already heard about, and also regulatory issues, which may come around and basically just make all of this much, much harder, or at least very difficult in certain markets in the world. And I wanted to finish this little bit of this section by looking at Tommy Thompson, who's done some fantastic work. He's been working in this space for decades. Has an academic background in AI and games and is now running a weekly newsletter, which I highly recommend. He's been highlighted some interesting case studies that I think speak to where we will see this being used creatively. Generative AI is what I'm referring to here. And he gave a recent example for Capcom that are using tools to develop kind of early ideas for particular sort of assets in the world or ways they might be visualized. The idea is that once they're fleshed out, they would no longer use the tool and an artist would go away and build all of that, which sounds great in many ways. The sort of flip side of that, and this is what some AI law researchers have been looking into, is that can often mean that the sort of junior tasks that early stage artists, designers might work on are no longer the things they can work on because they're being taken by the kind of automation side. They're being taken over by automation. And that could have a long-term negative impact on the industry. Doesn't seem to be being picked up in the context of the kind of massive problems around layoffs that the industry is having at the moment. Indeed, in the GDC report, people aren't sort of linking AI and job losses together because of the wider problems the industry has. But it could be that long term you have a sort of junior cohort that don't have the sort of same skills that the more senior people do in the industry now, and that could have long-term impacts on how the industry runs and works. So it can be fine to have them as sort of early stage creative tools, but there is still an interesting context there to think about as well. The final thing I wanted to come to was some of the work that we're actually doing to sort of pick apart some of these assumptions in the kind of more commercial research and indeed in the academic research around games and AI and writing. And I wanted to frame it with this quote here from from Imwen again in their latest white paper from last year. They say player engagement and immersion, giving players the agency to impact the narrative in meaningful ways through your actions, and also to talk to NPCs as though they're real people. Real people will inevitably make gaming more immersive and engaging. This is their kind of assumption and prediction. Again, based on actually quite flimsy work that they've done, or kind of just perspectives, rather than actually being able to point and show that this is indeed happening. They have gone on to do some more work with people, just sort of with industry people trying their tools that I think is more interesting than this more kind of high level stuff. But that's what we wanted to poke at, as it were, when we started work on a My World collaborative R&D project with industry lead Meaning Machine, who are doing very different things in this space. And I think the model that they're working with is one that I'm very interested in seeing develop, because what it is it's about telling new stories and developing even what you might call new genres of games. Indeed, their prototype game Dead Meat, which is the one we're using for our current study, has been termed by Thomas Keane, the co-founder of Meaning Machine, a first-person talker. So a new kind of genre of game made possible by generative AI, but hugely and highly constrained by human creativity, that basically tailors every part of the kind of conversation that you can have here. And Dead Meat is a murder mystery game that is currently playable as a demo, and we're using that in our study. It requires text input or sometimes voice input, and you get either text or voice output from it. And we're using it as our model to sort of really try and plug a bit of a gap in the academic literature, as well as poke at that kind of more commercial expectations of AI NPCs. This is far from that kind of throw some AI NPCs into a Sims-like game or into a massive open world game. This is instead, a really creative, highly original, very new form of engaging with kind of traditional modes of storytelling. So we're all familiar with murder mysteries. Here's a very new way of potentially designing one where you're in the seat of an interrogator in this case, and you can ask quite literally anything, and the system will respond in any completely tailored to those inputs. So what we've sort of noted in the academic research is that a lot of people have been putting, again, ChatGPT, building their own sort of tailored AI systems and putting them into existing games. But I don't think that's really the future of the industry. There are huge problems there, as people like Tommy Thompson have drawn attention to. So really, I think a lot of the creative potential sits at this sort of intersection of highly creative and original human-led ideas that perhaps use generative AI systems to power some elements or some aspects of that. And if that does end up being a kind of new space that indies work in, again, other indies are kind of going the opposite way and are developing currently sort of markers to say there's no generative AI was used in the creation of this game. So I know there's two ways this is sitting, but for those indies that are interested in working in that space creatively and in a co-creative way, then what we wanted to do was provide a research base to show the actual impact this might have on players. And so what we've done is we've recruited over 100 participants to come to Bristol this February and March. So this study is happening right as we speak to test out Dead Meat. We're using a completely mixed methods approach. And again, for those academics in the room, this will make a lot more sense than perhaps those who are less familiar with this. But basically what we're trying to do is capture as much as we can of the kind of gold standard measures in human-computer interaction and psychology. I'm working with a colleague, Dr. Chris Bevan, in computer science at Bristol to do this. So we want to really understand the people that we're putting through this study, their personal tendency to immersion, for instance, empathy, their curiosity, and indeed other really important information such as gender, which we had a hypothesis would have a role to play here. And then we have players play Dead Meat. We individually observe them. We get them to think aloud as they play, to sort of tell us what their mental model of the game is as it develops. And then we follow up with kind of surveys that are the most rigorous and highly tested surveys on games generally, to apply them to this kind of new genre that's emerging, along with a semi-structured interview. Can't really give, so I'm just wrapping up, Sarah. Can't give the results at this stage. Obviously, it's all in process, but just to sort of give a very high level gender, the results are loading on gender, which is really interesting. Players respond and approach these games in a completely unique and individual way, which I think is fascinating. And I look forward to being able to share the results of that as we write them up. And a final note, sorry, there was one more slide. This is relevant though, because Sarah and I are working on a project together as well that's outside of all of this, that's about broadening access AI tools, to games and XR storytelling. And this is about bringing together early stage creatives with academics working in this space to rigorously and critically evaluate the ethics, the implications, and the ways of potentially integrating and some of these tools that have been released onto the market, or turning resisting them in certain ways in the process of creating new games and XR stories. So we're really sort of very much interested in seeing the scope of this work develop. Thank you, and apologies for running over.
Thanks, Richard. I thought it was really interesting. We've talked before a lot about actually, as these tools become more sophisticated, they actually become less creative in the ways that the sort of responses you get, which is certainly something we've experienced. And I think they're at the point now where they look so accurate but are so inaccurate, and that's really problematic. And yeah, really interesting perspectives about actually what these tools mean for people entering the industry, and that sort of career development and skills gap that they may create in the future years. So we're very short of time. There have been some really interesting questions about how can we make sure we can use ethical frameworks, practical steps to tackle the issues of bias, and around, experimenting with these tools in a way that's ethical. And so I'm going to ask you, the three of you, to end with a sort of two-part question I'm constructing. The first that I'd like you to address is, what are the practical steps that people thinking of using these tools can take to ensure they're using them ethically, or to minimize the bias? And then secondly, in an ideal world, and if you're in charge, how would AI be used in games, if at all? So we'll go backwards, so starting with you, Richard, and then move to Joseph and finish with Imwen.
Okay, wow. I'm going to try and break down some kind of meaningful answer to those two really, really, really good questions. Practical steps. This is what we've been trying to explore with the AI tools and XR storytelling project. Can we come up with some kind of toolkit, community of practice that can continually query and test and work with the assumptions and the limitations of each of these systems, and talk and work out together where a way forward might be, or prototype together? That's sort of what we were aiming to do with that project. So I think, and that was just a small example of a project that I know other people are doing other things in that space. So I think that's going to be one way forward. I think there will also be more directives coming from sort of industry. Like I said, there's the company that developed Mythrect recently are coming up with a kind of a sort of I can't remember what the word is, but it's a sort of stamp of approval that this hasn't been worked. No AI has been sort of used in the process of making this. So I think there will be, depending on whether you want to use these tools or not, there will be kind of ways forward. There'll be guidance and practical kind of guidance that comes out, I think, there, as well as definitely a kind of pushback against it. And then the second question was around how would AI be used in games? Or it's a big question. I'm definitely a critical optimist in this space. I think that the work the Media Machine are doing, but it's not just them. There's lots of other interesting examples and demos coming out kind of right now that I think test the possibilities, the human creative possibilities enabled by these tools. Again, sort of challenging almost the fact that these tools are being built to us as we need more data to make something more intelligent or more creative. I think the opposite is true. It's about how we can be more creative with the kind of the small language models is what they're calling them, bringing models onto device, training them within a development, an industry developer, finding a way of customizing your own data and using a rigorous kind of approach and methodology there. I think there's so many ways that we'll see this side of things develop in exciting ways that moves us away from the kind of big tech, off the peg APIs and kind of models that I think will actually encounter a lot of legal challenges going forward. So I think I'm looking forward to seeing what more emerges in that space, and if we can do good research there to sort of understand how it's changing and shaping player behavior, and what kind of opportunities that opens up.
Thanks, Richard, and same to you, Joseph. How to use these tools in practical, ethical ways, and how would you see AI used in games?
Okay. I did enjoy the human talker like genre of games, and I think of the vampire game Suck Up, where you're like the LLM is not really part of the core mechanic. It's just like this fun bit, and I actually genuinely enjoyed that. And I feel like, okay, there's something interesting when it's not forced into existing structures and game mechanics that I do find very interesting. I think there's a lot to unpack in my answer, and I'm still thinking and processing. I don't think large language models can ever be ethical, because to achieve the higher order reasoning that they demonstrate has not been achieved without vast sets of data, including harmful data. Every attempt to try and alleviate this has produced models which don't have that higher reasoning ability, where they can take external unseen circumstances and reason about them. So it's very hard to imagine how LLMs could ever be ethical like that. I think if we're going to look for suggestions, again, Dr. Timnit has talked about small models, very specific, like niche slices, not trying to create the one model to solve them all. She gives some great examples around different languages, lots of different very specific niche trained languages which outperform things like ChatGPT when targeted on a very specific language. Again, the fact that American content dominates ChatGPT's training set means that it pretty much can't do most other languages. So small is more ethical. The human talker genre is fun and interesting, and I'd like to see that develop. Open models would be nice, being able to see the training sets. There are no commercial models which are truly open, even Meta's Llama, which it claims is open source. Nobody knows what the training data contains. Having visibility of the training data is exceptionally important for ethical use of these tools. As an example, ImageNet, that's a large image data training set, which is visible even after about 3 or 4 years of research. They found it contained effectively child abuse photos, and this is now present in anything that used that as a training set. The researchers were able to discover this because they could inspect the data set. So I think pushing for open models, which probably comes through regulation. I don't know how that happens with the current state of the US and their trade policies, and the UK, specifically government, just completely acquiescing to everything and anything that they say. So I don't know how to do ethical AI. I'm really interested in the research that's going on around it. I'm very happy that these questions and the space to ask difficult questions exist, and I think we should continue asking difficult questions and rejecting sometimes the technology. Yeah, so
Thanks, Joseph.
that's me.
Less of a critical optimist, I'm going to say. And Imwen, finally, your thought. Oh, you're muted.
Always. So I'm going to try and be brief. I'm going to say, in terms of how we move forward building AI, look at who's already doing the work around ethics, around justice, and around equality, and in and out of tech and in and out of playing games and play. So find out who they are, look at what they have that's existing, and just like we're talking about AI being our collaborative partner, also seek other new collaborative partners and maybe get some of those conversations going with these organizations and see how you can collaborate and build together. That my take. And then the other little bit, I'm just going to say it really shortly. I think that we need more exploration around play itself and what that is, because there's still lots of people who've been excluded from play and what it is and things like that. And we're rushing ahead to games, but and we should look at games. We should also look at play, because I think it was mentioned before, in its origin, it is still very colonial in itself. So there's swathes of research that we can do in lots of different areas. So yeah. I will stop there.
Thanks, Imwen. And I know Richard is answering some of the questions in the Q&A chat directed directly to him. So if you're still on, please wait for his answer. Thank you so much to the three of you. It's been absolutely fascinating and really interesting perspectives coming together. And yeah, there's definitely a lot I'm going to go away and think about after today. So thank you. And thank you to everyone who attended, and apologies for running over. And yeah, thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks.